Over to you, Ryan.
All right, thanks, Melissa. And yeah, thanks to Melissa and Colleen for setting this all up. And I really appreciate the invite. And I'm so happy to see everyone here. I can't see you, but I see the names. And yeah, so it's really great to see all of you here and have such a good attendance to this. Yeah, I'll just start sharing my presentation. I don't think I'll be able to see chat while I share my presentation because I'm just going to be here. But if you do want to stop the presentation to chat, just let me know. So yeah, my name is Ryan Lacanilao. I'm with the Alberta Living Wage Network. Before we start, I just want to acknowledge that wherever we are in Alberta right now, we are on treaty territory, Indigenous territory, and I'm with the Alberta Living Wage Network. Uh, I'm the coordinator and economist. And I think some people might not be muted because I can hear some stuff, but uh, yeah, just a little bit of background on who we are. We are a collaboration of organizations working together to to have a coordinated living wage movement in the province. And here are a bunch of our council members. We have a lot of people who meet every month to make sure that this happens. And just looking at your names, I can see some of the members are here right now. So yeah, hi to Andrea and Shauna and Angela. Those are the ones that I could see. But yeah, just a little bit of background. We just started coordinating so that we could have have a calculation that's done in a way that is standardized. And yeah, I'm just going to fly through this presentation because there's so much. And I haven't actually delivered this presentation before. You all are the first ones to hear it. I just finished it last night at 4:30 a.m. But don't worry, that's when I do my best work. I'm a night owl. So yeah, let's go through it. It's called Evidence for and Against Impact and Why It Matters. And it turns out there's a lot of evidence and it's dense. So I'm just going to kind of fly through it. And if you all want to go deeper in one particular part, just let me know. That's why oh, you know what? Since it's my first time, I don't know exactly how long it'll take me. I'm going to actually set an alarm on my phone to tell me when I have 5 minutes left. So let's go with 35 minutes. All right. Okay, let's do this. First, I'm going to start off just by talking about the difference between a minimum wage and a living wage. And I'll be referring to both in this presentation just because sometimes we use changes in minimum wage as a proxy for what would happen if a ton of people adopted a living wage, because that's moving the lowest paid people up, which is kind of what living wage does in a different kind of way. So the difference is that minimum wage is the same across the entire province, no matter where you are. Living wage is community specific. So we actually take local data and figure out, well, what's the living wage in Fort McMurray versus Edmonton versus Drumheller? You know, we have all of the local data because it does cost more to live in some places than others. It's minimum wage is mandatory. It's law. It's the law. Living wage is voluntary, so it's not something that's mandated. It's just recognizing those who go above and beyond to pay a living wage if you're an employer. For minimum wage, you can work full time and still live in poverty, and we know that because like our calculations show that in all of the communities that we did a calculation for, minimum wage wasn't enough to cover the basket of goods and services. So for living wage, you're more able to make ends meet. It's not a guarantee because it's based on assumptions and 3 household types, and we know that everyone has a different situation, but it is you're more able to make ends meet if you're making a living wage. So we at the Alberta Living Wage Network, we calculate the living wage every year in November. And we also have a certification program where we certify employers who commit to paying a living wage. And that here's our most recent living wage map. So you can see we have 21 different communities across Alberta that we did a calculation for locally. The general way we do it is we have a basket of goods that includes all of these things that you see here, and we calculate what a single individual would need, a lone parent with one child, and as well as a family of four. So it's basically saying like, hey, if you make 18 bucks an hour, what's going to happen? Will you be able to afford all these things after your taxes are taken and after all your benefits from the government are given, like the childcare benefit and all the benefits? So it takes everything into account, and then we mash them together, these three calculations together, to come up with a living wage rate that is the weighted average of all three. So, okay, that was just a little bit of background on what a living wage is. Let's get right into it. So I'm going to be going through some evidence with you today. And if you do take a look at the literature, you'll notice a few things. One is that there's not a lot of Canadian data or research. There is some, which I'll be referring to today, but it's not as like we often refer to other jurisdictions because that's where most of the deep research has been done. There's a lot of political interest biasing research that we can see in whatever, just sometimes we can tell from the language and how it's being presented. And there's also complexity in policies and frameworks. So it depends how we're approaching living wage, whether we're talking about employers paying living wage or policies, living wage policies for communities or jurisdictions. And there's also the theory versus reality. So there's research out there that are theories about here's what would happen. But as an economist, I also evaluate my own theories and models against reality. So a theory is only as good as it predicts reality. So there's that aspect too. So anyways, just thought I'd give you like a little bit of a outside perspective on what the literature looks like, but we'll dive into the actuals right now. So it's for and against, but what I'm going to do is use, I'm actually inspired by Tricia Boonstra from St. Albert. She emailed me saying like, hey, check out this document. It has a whole bunch of evidence against a living wage. Can we chat about it? And I turned it into this presentation. So that's basically what we're going to do. It's this, when you get the slides, this will be clickable. It'll actually be a hyperlink. So you can check out this, this report. It's by the Canadian Federation of Independent Business. It's called Affordability, Minimum Wages, and Living Wages. And it has key takeaways. And what I'm going to do is go one by one through these key takeaways, and I'll bring up the evidence that they show, and then we can talk about it, because stats are stats. You can sometimes look at the same stat and have a different takeaway. And I'll also, this is Canadian, I'll show some Alberta specific data that we have as well from another report that was done. So okay, so every time you see CFIB, know that I'm like directly quoting from this document. So, because that stands for the Canadian Federation of Independent Business. So the first two bullets from the key takeaways are that most minimum wage workers are young people entering the workforce with a high school education or less, living with their parents, and that most minimum wage jobs are transitional, often serving as a starting point for young workers. And here's what they use to back it up. These are just screenshots from their report. So you can see the age distribution is 15 to 19 is 37%. And they use that to say most minimum wage workers, so 57%, they're combining, so up to age 24, are young people entering the workforce. So if the data has already been done for me, then I'm going to do it. It's not like as recent as now. This was done by the minimum wage expert panel that the government of Alberta put together, and it was released in 2020. And they do have real stats out there. They were put together to kind of, try and say why not to raise the minimum wage. But you know what? Stats are stats. So they have the Alberta numbers, and it saves me a lot of time and energy and searching and getting custom data tables and all that. And it's like they did it already. So I'm going to refer to this a lot just to get the Alberta specific data. So here's the Alberta specific data. We can see I highlighted the 10.9% because these are the people who are not adults. So 10.9% are not adults in their most recent data, 2018-19, when they looked it up in the labor force survey, which does mean that, 89% were adults. They did, I mean, yeah, they're not wrong about like a certain amount being younger, but when we break it down, we can see that 89.1% are adults, 74.9% are 20 plus. Like, yeah, at this, where minimum wage earners are often adults. I guess we can see from this. So adults that want to, make ends meet and move out on their own, depending on your age and your life and what you're doing. They have a figure here that says most minimum wage jobs don't require high levels of specialization. And they show this table to kind of back that up. They say, 29% have less than high school, 28% have high school. At least some post-secondary, 45%. Like I can look at this same data that they're using and say 45% have some sort of post-secondary. Like I don't even have to pull up different data. This is just an example of how you can look at the same exact data and just say it in a different way. And here it is for Alberta. For Alberta, we see minimum wage earners. Yeah, note that we're talking about minimum wage, not living wage, but still, I'm just working with the document that is kind of being against a living wage right now and working on their playground or whatever. So yeah, I highlighted the percentages on the side here so we can see that almost half have at least some post-secondary, which is consistent with what the report says, but they're like, oh, let's use the word most. Most minimum wage jobs don't require high levels of specialization. Well, almost half, at least, of minimum wage workers do have post-secondary. More than a third actually have a degree or a certificate or a diploma. That sounds like a lot to me, but okay. This is kind of one that I just could not reconcile. I'd like to see their data because it says most minimum wage workers are sons or daughters living with their parents. So sure, they say 59% are sons or daughters living with, does that say parents? Yeah. And they point out here in that little 6%, which is head of the family with no spouse present. So maybe a lone parent family. So 1.5% of minimum wage earners have a child under the age of 18, which sounds really small, right? Well, when we look at the actual Alberta data, 41.4% of minimum wage workers have children under 18. Like, to me, that's huge. And like almost half are raising children under 18. And when I try to like look at their number here, the 1.5%, they're looking at single parents employed with children under 18. In Alberta, that's 6.6%. I don't know, in Canada, is it 1.5%? Anyways, their data doesn't really make sense to me, but the other thing that I wanted to combine with them, like I think the 1.5% with child under the age of 18 is a little misleading because it doesn't include those who are married single earners, which is even harder. Because yeah, if you're a single parent and you have children, now add another adult in the mix that you're also responsible for because they're not working and not making an income. So when we combine those two together, that 6.1 plus 6.6%, we see that 12.7% are single earners with children under 18. So minimum wage earners in Alberta, almost half of them have children and are raising children. 12.7% are the only earners in their family and have children under 18. 35.5% are the main income earner, which is pretty wild when you think that someone making the minimum possible amount is the main income earner in the family. So there's a stat there. And so I also have like, sometimes you'll see also true. So it just means like, yeah, they are presenting some stats. Here's what's also true about the stats if we think about it. At minimum wage, you can't afford to move out. So their argument that, minimum wage earners have have a spouse that's making more than minimum wage. Well, yeah, to survive. And and they can be trapped in financially dependent relationships. If you're making minimum wage and you can't afford rent to move out on your own, you could be trapped. So the stats that show that if you ever hear someone say, "Oh, they're not even in poverty," the people in making a minimum wage, they're living with someone who's making more money. They're not in poverty. Well, they're also maybe trapped because they don't make enough to move out. Um, and yeah, 12.7% are single earners with children under 18. I put that in there twice because yes, it's true. And that's a lot bigger than what I can see from their tables here. But okay. They also, to back up those 2 points, say minimum wage jobs are transitional and often serve as a starting point for young workers. And they back that up using this evidence, which is that when you look at how long a minimum wage worker has been with their position, 42% of the time it's less than a year. 42% of the time it's 1 to 5 years. So that means 84% of the time it's less, it's 5 years or less. So yeah, they're right. They're right that the tenure is short. But what they say that, oh, they're just starting points for young workers, even though we already know that, most are adults. But this is also true using the exact same stats that they're using here. Minimum wage jobs don't pay a living wage, so there will be super high turnover. 42% leave within a year, 84% leave within 5 years, and it's for survival. So it's almost like it's the chicken or the egg. Like you can say like, oh yeah, it's because they're just transitional positions. Or you could say, well, of course it's super high turnover because you can't live there long term. You won't be able to make ends meet. You'll spiral into debt. So these stats aren't surprising at all. Minimum wage versus living wage is one thing that I'm going to bring up right now because I use minimum wage stats because I was on the same playing field as I was trying to compare directly with the stats in that report. But those that make up minimum wage only make up a small portion of those making below a living wage. So we're looking at those making $15 an hour, but what about those making $15, 15.25? What about those making 15.50? Those making 15.75? Those making 16, those making 17, those making 18. There's all these people whose demographics should be taken into account because they're all struggling. So when this report just only looks at people making $15 an hour and tries to gain insights from that, they're actually missing out on what they should be looking at, which is everyone who would benefit from a living wage. So yeah, just thought I would point that out before moving on to the next key takeaway from that report. So here are the next 2 bullets in that key takeaway from that report against living wage. Minimum wage setting processes are unpredictable, subjective, and lack transparency and consideration of economic effects. And you know what? I'm just going to go ahead and put a check mark there because it's true, and I agree. Minimum wage growth has outpaced inflation, labor productivity, and median wage increases in the last 10 years. Okay, let's look at their stats. And one of the reasons why I agree with that bullet that says that the processes are unpredictable, subjective, is because you can see in Alberta how unpredictable minimum wage setting has been. In 2018, Alberta had the highest minimum wage in the country at $15 an hour. That was 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25. That was 7 years ago. And now it has the lowest. So it went from the highest to the lowest, and we haven't even moved. We're the only province who hasn't moved minimum wage for the last 7 years. To me, that's pretty unpredictable and makes no sense. So yeah, that bullet does make sense to me. But let's talk about this second bullet about how minimum wage growth has outpaced inflation. Here's what they show. The red line shows the hourly wage, minimum wage, and how much it has grown. So on the right, for example, it's a 10-year average. It's grown on average 4.2%. That's the average in Canada. While CPI has gone up, so inflation has gone up 2.5% per year in the last 10 years, and labor productivity has gone up 0.6%. Also true, here's what minimum wage in Alberta looks like. It increased 47% in 3 years. So that was between 2015 and 2018. It went from 10.20 to 15. And then it increased 0% in 7 years. It's still at 15. So as I mentioned, it went from the highest to the lowest. And so what's also true, like if we were to make a graph like this for Alberta, we could choose the last 7 years, and that red line would be non-existent because it's zero. For the last 7 years, minimum wage has not kept up with inflation and labor productivity because it has gone up zero in Alberta. So to try and say like, oh, minimum wage has gone up so much, well, it has gone up nothing in the last 7 years for us here in Alberta. They also use this data to say the bite of minimum wage has increased in the last decade, with some provinces reaching potentially damaging levels, which sounds scary. And the damaging levels, they're talking about how it will have an effect on employment. So, when minimum wage becomes more than, they often say 50% of, when it becomes more than 50% of the median wage, then they're saying that it has the potential to cause loss of employment. So you can see some are above 50. Alberta here went from 2013, 38 to 46 in 2023. Let's look at the minimum wage expert panel. Who is, like, let's be clear, like they were trying to make evidence against raising the minimum wage, but they used real data, and data is data. So this is a screenshot from their report. Both conventional regression techniques and synthetic control technique indicate no statistically significant relationship between the 2015 to 2018 minimum wage increase, which was that 47% increase in 3 years, and employment amongst Albertans aged 25 and older. So the CFIB report is really saying they care about, the workers 25 and older, because they're saying, part of their argument was, oh, they're all too young to even matter. But here we're talking about the ones that matter to them, the Albertans aged 25 and older. And they found that tens of thousands of additional Albertans lost their jobs, including those 25 and older. But those losses were influenced by other factors, including the economic downturn. Yeah, so the way that this regression works, as an economist, I would say like, here's jobs losses as the dependent variable, and I'm going to throw some independent variables into there to say like, how do these variables affect the loss of jobs? So if you throw minimum wage in there, but then you also throw in the economic downturn, you'll see that the model shows that, oh, the economic downturn can actually explain the loss in jobs, and it's not actually due to the minimum wage increasing by 47%, which is huge. So we saw even with a gigantic 47% minimum wage increase in 3 years, that there was no statistically significant relationship to employment of Albertans 25 plus. So this bite of the minimum wage didn't happen in Alberta, even when we raised the minimum wage 47%. Let's move on to the next bullet in that key takeaway. At its core, the concept of a living wage is flawed due to the diversity in individual preferences, varying levels of willingness to pay for goods, and unique thresholds for financial well-being. And I had to kind of sit there and read each of these one by one. And the conclusion I came to is that what's flawed is their understanding of what a living wage is. So they say, oh, it's flawed because of the diversity in individual preferences, but the living wage is flexible enough for individual preferences. Like we actually include individual preferences into the calculation, like whether they drive versus transit. We take the average of that in big cities. Car versus truck, we actually have SUV, truck, car, hatchback, all in there in the calculation. We have flexibility for different kinds of recreation. Varying levels of willingness to pay for goods and services is something why they said that living wage is flawed, but it uses averages and it's not meant to be exact for each person. Like we're not trying to say that that's not even what we're trying to do. Unique thresholds for financial well-being, true, but the only threshold that we have to agree upon for living wage is that spiraling debt is bad because it's just the point that you can afford the basket of goods and have no money left over. So this whole bullet just doesn't really make sense. It just shows a misunderstanding of living wage. The next bullet says mandating a $20 per hour living wage in each province would cost $44.9 billion, which sounds big and scary, potentially fueling inflationary pressures and putting more than 500,000 businesses at risk of unprofitability. So I'll address these highlighted ones first. Yeah, here's what they do. They say like, here's how much it would cost to mandate $20 an hour. First of all, living wage, we ain't trying to do that. We're not trying to mandate one number for the entire province or anything like that. We're not even trying to mandate anything. We're just doing this calculation so that we can have insight into policy and also to recognize and certify employers who commit to paying a living wage. But let's play with them in their world. Yes, if we mandated $20 an hour, this is how much it would cost. And it's such a simple calculation. I looked up how they did it. All they did is look at the cost of raising all employees making below $20 to $20 an hour. It doesn't consider the cost savings of increased productivity, which is $54 billion in Canada in the last year, or the cost savings of decreased turnover. And it doesn't consider increased revenue from people with money to spend in the local economy, since all of these people would now have enough money to spend in the local economy when they didn't. So here's what's missing. That $54 billion per year is just Canada. And that's how much employers would save if they were to pay well, because this is how much is lost due to financial stress in terms of lost productivity. That already 54 billion is bigger than their number there of 44.9 billion. So yeah, if you raise everyone to a level where they're not financially stressed, you'll already save just from productivity alone. You'll save more than the cost of doing that. And here's what else is missing: the decreased turnover. This is a link, so you can click it, but it has an outline of a bunch of studies that have been done. So in LA, they actually this is the biggest study. They looked at 75 living wage employers versus 210 firms that in the similar field that weren't paying living wage. And the turnover rate is 17% lower for those paying living wage. And we have some specific examples as well in the literature. So for example, airport security in San Francisco, this is huge. Their turnover went from 95% to 19% when they raised the wages. Also, home care workers, the turnover rate went down 57%. KPMG in London, they reported that they halved their turnover rate when they started paying a living wage. What else is missing? That the stimulus to the local economy, which is something that I mentioned, it's actually good. It's a positive impact to businesses because people have money to spend on your business if everyone was making at least 20 bucks an hour. So Goldman Sachs did a study. They found that the low earners spend more of their increased income in the local economy. Those in the highest 20%, so the highest quintile of income, they only spend 3 to 5 cents of every dollar raised, extra additional dollar in the local economy. So it's basically nothing and it's all gone. So if you want to have more money in the local economy and spent on the small businesses, it's about raising those low earners to a point where they can now spend on stuff that they couldn't before. There's also a study that looked at 23 years of household spending data. And they found that for every dollar raise in minimum wage, the families with minimum wage workers increased their spending by more than $800 per quarter. So when the people who are making the least get a little bit more, they spend that on the stuff that they needed in the local economy. So here's the reality. What they did is all they did is look at that top one, labor costs. They said, oh, well, if you increase wages, here's how much it's going to cost. But they only looked at labor costs. That's the upward pressure that they looked at. But they didn't take into account that there would be tons of cost savings due to decreased turnover. It's really expensive to hire on and train and do all this stuff. There's a ton of cost savings in terms of productivity, like $54 billion just in Canada alone, if you don't stress out your employees due to financial stress. And the increased revenue from that extra spending that is going to happen in the local economy. So all of that stuff wasn't taken into account. All right, here's their table that they use. Mandating $20 an hour living wage will put almost 600,000 businesses at risk of unprofitability. And I tried to look at their calculations, and guess what? There is none. This was actually just a survey that they sent out to some of their members, and then they said, like, okay, what if we extrapolate this to all businesses in Canada? Oh, that's 42% of all businesses will be at risk of unprofitability, just based on a survey of businesses that said, yeah, $20 an hour is going to make me unprofitable. But there were no calculations done to be like, will it really? So it's just, sometimes we have survey results and they can make these big claims, but they're not actually what it seems like it is. Mandating a $20, oh, here's the part that I'm going to address now. It's how mandating a $20 an hour living wage would potentially fuel inflationary pressures. And this is something that I hear a lot, and it's more of a thing of fear because people are scared of inflation. So they're like, hey, it's going to cause inflation. But what actually happens in reality, and we do have data on that because it's great that Seattle has this minimum wage ordinance. It's actually the minimum wage in Seattle right now is almost $20 an hour US. Anyways, when they started doing their own thing with their minimum wage, the University of Washington researchers, they analyzed how much, inflation, the cost of food is going to go up in Seattle. So they followed the cost of food in Seattle and compared it to the other communities outside of Seattle that have the same conditions yet didn't have a minimum wage increase. So we should see that if Seattle raises its minimum wage and the other ones don't, then the costs, if it really is true, the costs of food will go up in the grocery stores. They found no significant evidence of price increase associated with minimum wage ordinance. That's 2 years after having an increased minimum wage in Seattle. So in reality, it didn't cause inflation. And let's go closer to home. This is Alberta. This is specific to Alberta, this green line. Alberta right now, this is the most recent one. I just got it. November 2024, in the previous year, Alberta has seen the highest inflation out of all the provinces. All the other provinces raised their minimum wage. We're the only ones who didn't. So shouldn't we be protected from inflation, and their increase in price cause inflation? Didn't happen. And you can actually go through this on all the years. In the last 7 years, Alberta is the only one to not raise minimum wage. And you'll see there is no pattern that Alberta is somehow protected from inflation compared to the other provinces. Let's look at reality. It ain't happening. So yeah, it's a fear tactic that doesn't actually happen in real life. And then the last three bullets in this report. Yeah, I'll just read through them a bit. So while businesses are responsible for providing competitive wages based on skills and experience, taxes and regulations significantly impact the affordability of essentials like rent, utilities, food, childcare, transportation. That's true. We agree with that. That's why we actually use the living wage calculation, and it includes all policy. It includes the childcare subsidies, the childcare affordability grants. It includes all taxes. It includes all policy that affects affordability. So agreed. Governments have, here's the second bullet, second to last bullet, I guess. Governments have a responsibility to ensure that workers are better positioned to handle the rising cost of living without solely relying on businesses to bear the financial burden of addressing the economic challenges workers face. True, we do believe that. So we're in agreement with these like big conclusions that this report is making and trying to say, you know, living wage is flawed, but we actually agree with their conclusions here. The governments have responsibility. The living wage actually includes that into the calculation, all of what the government does for affordability. And we don't believe that businesses bear all the financial burden, not at all. That's why we take all of that policy into account and we advocate for good affordability policy. At the last election, we made a little list of questions that you can ask your candidates that talk about affordability. And we don't think that businesses bear the financial burden of addressing the economic challenges. They're not the ones who got us here. But what we do agree with is that if you are a business and you commit to paying the living wage, you should be recognized for going above and beyond. Addressing the root causes of the rising cost of living, coupled with providing targeted fiscal support to vulnerable workers, presents a more effective approach to dealing with Canada's affordability challenges, all without burdening small businesses and added expenses and responsibility. Now, I'm just going to say it's not an all or nothing thing here, and I do agree with this, with what they're saying. And I also agree that if businesses want to commit to paying a living wage, then we should it's also an effective approach that works, and it's something that we want to certify them for, celebrate them for, because they're going above and beyond. And yeah, so I do agree with this, as well as like seeing what we do as a service to businesses, because they approached it from a certain angle where they saw it as an attack on businesses, but it's actually a service to businesses. We're saying like, if you pay a living wage, we want to celebrate that fact. Thank you for going above and beyond. You know, if you don't, we're not out there like twisting arms or anything. We understand that businesses, it doesn't fall solely on businesses, and that businesses aren't who got us in this place in the first place. So yeah, check marks to all three of these. In the start, I felt I had to do this because in the very start, I'll go to my very first slide. Wow, it's so far away. The title of this was Evidence for and Against, which we just went through, Impact, and Why It Matters. So, oh, this is good timing. That means that my 35 minutes is up and it's time for questions. So I'll just go with the impact. I just went with one slide and then there's one slide. So as I mentioned before, we should be looking at the stats aren't even looking at the right thing. We should be looking at who makes under $20 an hour, not just that tiny portion who makes $15 an hour, but those who make under a living wage, and let's just use $20 an hour, that's what they used. The actual stats are, in reality, they're not teenagers working part-time after school, living with parents, earning extra spending money. The reality is that they're adults. The majority are women, and a whole bunch have children under 18. In those earlier stats that I showed, it was 41%. In these stats, which were pulled by VCC based on the 2021 labor force survey, it was 36%. But the impact is that living wages put money in the pockets of workers who really need it. It reduces inequality, and it supports a sustainable local economy. That's the actual impact. I can go deeper on any one of those if you want, but I just put those three up. So the evidence for and against, which we finished, impact, which is this, and why it matters. I wanted to leave why it matters to all of you. So I do have some discussion questions, but you can ask anything about anything in this whole presentation. It's the most dense presentation I ever gave because, hey, evidence is in the title, so you signed up for it. I hope that that you were okay with it was just basically presenting evidence. So here are the discussion questions. How do living wages affect workers? How do living wages affect broader social systems? What does this mean for you? What does it mean for FCSS programs? that's the end of my presentation. But I will leave these discussion questions up in case any of you want to talk about them right now. So maybe I'll stop presenting and I'll check the chat if there are any questions, and or you can raise your hand or unmute if you want to ask any questions too. Thanks, everyone. All right, I see in the chat, I don't think there are questions, but does anyone want to go deeper on anything or have any comments or questions about what I went through? I kind of really flew through it. So if you want me to spend more time on a specific slide, or if you want to talk about those discussion questions, like how would a living wage that puts money in the pockets of the workers who really need it and reduces inequality, supports a sustainable local economy. If more people made a living wage, how would that affect your FCSS programs, or what can you do to support a living wage, or were you convinced by the evidence against? Like, yeah, I left all this time at the end just so that we could have this time to discuss. So Emily, I see your hand is up, so feel free to unmute.
Thanks. I actually don't have any questions, but I just wanted to say I really appreciate the presentation. It was really validating. A lot of what we're seeing with a lot of our clients that are very low income or have, minimal access to resourcing and housing is exactly what you explained, honestly. Like we have a lot of clients that are on income supports, and if they're a single client, they're lucky to get $850, $900 a month. And that's supposed to, include their food, their rent, it's supposed to include everything, and it's impossible for a lot of these folks to live off that money, and many folks are relying on a lot of low income jobs, or like applying for McDonald's. Like I have one gentleman that has applied to Walmart I don't know how many times to try and get a job there, and it's just not enough money to pay the bills. And most households we're seeing now is mom, dad, or two parents with their children, and they each have a job full time, and then they each have a second job, often a lot of times, or a third job, just to keep up with, building life for their family, building life in the community, and trying to stay in the community. Many of our people here want to stay in Strathmore, but it's not financially sustainable, right? Like, there's no rentals, there's very limited low income housing. Our one of our low income housing, our Chinook 3 building, we actually were just informed that it was bought out by a private company. So now the prices are going to increase and we're losing low income housing. So this conversation is just really validating. And I just want to say I appreciate it, because we're seeing a lot of what you're talking about in person in the ground level. So thank you.
Of course, I really appreciate that. So yeah, thank you. We interviewed some people with lived experience and asked them about what it was like to try and make ends meet. So we know that it's not easy, that it's hard, it's almost impossible. You have multiple jobs, you don't have time to spend with your family and your loved ones. It's tough. And I saw this one meme or this screenshot on Instagram or something, and it was just someone saying like, fast food workers shouldn't expect a living wage. And then someone else responded saying, then you shouldn't expect fast food. And I thought, yeah, that about sums it up, because
Well,
shouldn't
exactly.
people who work be able to live?
Well, you really think about it, and it's called minimum wage. It should be the minimum wage available, or, the minimum amount that you need to live, right? And it isn't. People are getting paid $15 an hour, $16 an hour, and are not able to live. They don't spend money in the community because they can't afford it, right? They're not eating well, they're not healthy because they can't afford it, right? So this minimum wage is really not meeting the minimum requirements to live.
So true. And we have the data to back that up. If you go on our website and look at our calculations, minimum wage does not cover what's needed for a family for a single lone parent family and for a single individual. Thanks so much, Emily. I really appreciate it. We'll go Aaron and then Shelly, and then I see one in the comments. So Aaron.
Hi there, Ryan. Thank you for the presentation. Very, very interesting, especially coming from an economist's perspective on all of this. It's kind of my first, look at living wage. So it was an interesting introduction, especially coming at it from an evidence-based perspective and kind of combating maybe some myths or looking at, as you said, we can look at data from two different perspectives. And I wanted to ask a couple more questions, being kind of new to that, and some of the other we call myths out there, or different perspectives. One of the things that I often hear about raising the minimum wage up to a living wage is that there's an increased risk of greater unemployment because of the risk that employees will start to look for more technology solutions as opposed to hiring people to do the work. I'm just curious if you've run across anything in your research that has validated or perhaps contradicted that point of view.
Yeah. Like when the Alberta government put together that expert panel on minimum wage to try and argue to not raise minimum wage, I actually just pulled from there that one bullet that shows that when minimum wage went up 47% in 3 years, they put the data in, they ran the regressions, and it resulted in no job losses. All the job losses, there were tens of thousands of job losses, were explained when they put in a variable for that followed the economy. So any job losses could be explained just literally by the downturn. That's a pretty huge one, and that's specific to Alberta. So it's hard to get better evidence than that. It's specific to Alberta. It's a gigantic raise. It's almost like we did this in a lab, like 47% in 3 years. That actually happened. So we should have expected tons of job losses because of that, if that were true. But what we saw was all the job losses we saw were explained by the economic downturn. So we do have the evidence to show that didn't happen in real life. So as an economist, you just say, well, that theory doesn't work. Let's come up with something else. Yeah. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. And if I could just have a quick follow-up. Curious with the numbers around post-secondary education and those in minimum wage. I guess two questions on that. One is, was there any evidence to show whether or not people were actually utilizing their post-secondary education in the jobs that they were doing? And second was, in the numbers that were being presented, are they recognizing people who have post-secondary education, perhaps from other countries that are not recognized in Canada?
Good questions. So this is from the labor force survey. They don't actually ask, are you in a job that was for what you studied? So we don't have that. We can't answer that using the labor force data, which is what the numbers that we use and that report uses. And it's a survey, and it just whatever people answer. So when they say, what's your level of education, they fill that out, and that's what's reported in our stats. So yeah, it'll include people who were educated somewhere else. And I see what you're saying, like people are educated somewhere really well, they come here and then they're stuck in a minimum wage position. And that's why we see like 45% of minimum wage workers have post-secondary. Like they looked at it and said, oh, look, most don't have post-secondary. These aren't skilled jobs. But you can look at that and say like, almost half actually do. Isn't that a thing? So looking at the same thing with two different perspectives, and they're both true, but yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Aaron. And I see Shelly, then I'll go to the comment, and then Tamara.
Thanks for your presentation. I came in about halfway through it because I got caught up in something else. But so if this was already in your presentation, please just tell me to look at it later. But you talked about you looked at Seattle, where they raised the minimum wage. Did you look at other places also that had raised their minimum wage and looked at the impact that it was having on them, those kind of countries. Like I'm thinking Australia, they're paid very well. Their minimum wage is quite healthy as far as I know. And so things like tipping and whatnot aren't, you don't have to do that. And here we seem to subsidize our minimum wage workers by the tipping. So I was just curious if you looked at other communities and countries.
Yeah, that's a great question. So what I looked at is what is available in the literature, like readily available. And when an economist is looking for like empirical data on something, we can't just go and say like, let's raise the wage
Yeah,
here and not here. So we were kind of stuck with what happens in real life. And what happened in Australia isn't necessarily, do they have a control? Do we know like what happened in Seattle is the perfect situation because we have controls of the communities that are right outside of Seattle that are all facing the same economic conditions, that are all in the same country, in the same state, and that didn't raise their minimum wage. And then we have Seattle. It's almost as if this was thought up in a lab, but it wasn't.
right.
And so now we're able to look at this real life situation and say, wow, it's as if I thank you for this bounty,
Yeah.
and then that the University of Washington researchers were able to analyze what happened. I don't see that same kind of research
Okay.
in Australia or in other places. Like we're
Yeah.
just lucky to have this situation happen in Seattle, and then we're able to glean lots of things from it. But yeah, that's one of the only ones, and maybe the best one that I have that has this many controls and
Right.
was
Which
built in a
is
lab. Yeah.
from a research perspective, that's exactly what you want, right?
Mhm.
Is to have that ideal situation. And what is the living wage, which you probably mentioned that earlier. I was looking at it a few months ago. I was just wondering if it's changed. Like,
As of what I know right now, it's just barely under $20 US per hour in
okay,
Seattle right now.
in
Yeah.
Seattle and in Alberta?
$15 an hour CAD.
No, that's what we pay, but what would be the living wage is
Oh, the
different.
living wage.
The
The
living
living
wage,
wage in
sorry.
Seattle,
Yeah,
I'm not sure what the living wage in Seattle
okay,
is, but in Alberta,
yeah,
it ranges. I think the lowest is Medicine Hat in 17 something, and mostly are around the 20
yeah.
area. Calgary is up there because of the housing crisis and the rentals just skyrocketing. It's at 24.45.
Wow. Yeah, that's it's quite a difference for community to community.
It is,
Okay.
yeah. They all have their local data to calculate it, so we see those differences. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Ryan.
Thanks, Shelley. I'll go to the comment real quick. It says, is there current support/government support available to businesses who choose to provide a living wage? The answer to that is no. No, there isn't. Tamara?
Hi, thank you. Great information there, Ryan. I really appreciate all of the work that you've done. Oh, hey. Hi, everyone. Um, I also wanted to echo what Emily was saying there at the beginning. You know, here locally in Peace River, we're 5 hours north of Edmonton, and we recently just suffered two apartment fires, almost back to back, about a month apart, and they're low income housing. And so, you know, to further the conversation, um, it makes me wonder too if some of the programming that we're offering often is targeted towards individuals within this tax bracket. And, you know, since COVID, we've seen a downturn in individuals being able to attend some of this programming, these events. And it makes you wonder if this is a little bit tied to as well. People don't have, like they're, like you had said, they're taking 1, 2, 3 jobs, and they're not able to come to some of this programming that is preventative and could help um, within their lives. And so it's really interesting how, you know, we talked about how it affects different things, but it is also affecting us in the work that we do.
100%. What you're describing here is a negative spiral. It's a vicious cycle when you can't, when you don't make a living wage, you can't make ends meet. So now you don't have time to do what it takes to make ends meet. You don't have the energy and the time to get more education. You don't have the money to buy like good clothes. Then all of a sudden your cell phone gets cut off. So how are you even supposed to apply for jobs without a callback number? And then it's a negative spiral of poverty. And we see living wage is a virtuous cycle. It's the positive spiral, because now all of a sudden you don't need to work multiple jobs. Now you can afford those clothes that make you more professional. You can afford to upgrade your education. It's a positive spiral, and it's so simple, right? So yeah, thank you for pointing that out. Really appreciate it. I think there's 2 minutes left, I believe, and there's something in the comments. In the area where I live, Northern Alberta, the cost of everything is even higher than in an urban setting. Has there been any information about why the minimum wage has not been increased in the last 7 years, especially when the cost of living has increased so much? Our clients and even higher paid individuals are suffering so much. There is no information. Literally, the government just says, no, we're not interested. But their own report that they put together to try and argue against raising the minimum wage says, let's wait. Like you can read it, it's linked in there. It's the one that I've been referring to for the Alberta data. They're against like minimum wage, yet they use this data, and what they conclude with is that we should not raise our minimum wage until we're kind of in the middle of the pack in Canada, because at that time we were at the top. And then we should tie it to inflation and median income. Sounds reasonable, right? So what has happened? We went there. We were in the middle of the pack because everyone else, all other provinces raised their minimum wage, yet we did nothing. And then all of a sudden we're not in the middle of the pack. Now we're at the bottom of the pack and we still did nothing. So we're not even following the recommendations of the expert panel that this government put together to try and not raise the minimum wage. We're doing less than what their experts are saying that we should do. And the experts were hired to try and argue against minimum wage. So it's kind of wild what's happening right now. All right, that's my time. It's 10:30. I'll hand things back to Melissa. And I want to thank you all for having me. And my contact info is in there, and you'll get the slides. So, and the slides have hyperlinks, so try and click around. Like those reports, you can actually go to them, you know, if you want some casual reading. So thanks all.
Thank you very much, Ryan. That was very interesting. We will share the slides or the presentation and the recording. If for some reason you don't receive it, check out our website under webinars. We will post it there also, or you can send us the FCSSAA an email and we'll make sure we get them out to you. So thanks again, Ryan. This was wonderful. Thank you everyone for joining us this morning, and have an excellent day. Take care, everyone. Bye.
Thanks all.